Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL Summer Playoffs Round 2 overview and analysis video. We covered Round 1 just a couple of days ago. You can go ahead and check that out up in the iCard right now if you want to go ahead and do that. But in this video, we are going to be going over the Round 2 matchups, of course, in the LPL. If you are one of those teams that did end up playing in Round 1, you basically got to run the entire gauntlet. There is no easy run, if you will, in the playoffs here in the LPL, at least for the bottom tier teams, the teams that didn't do as well in the regular season. Those teams really have to grind, and we definitely saw some very interesting series because of it here in round number 2. I'm excited to go over all the action, but I want to know what you guys thought of all of these games down in the comments section below. We're going to be covering both of the round 2 series in this video, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. By the end of this video, we are going to know the 6 teams that are qualified for the regional qualifier at the end of the split, the 6 teams that have an opportunity to represent the LPL at the World Championships this year. And so a lot on the line for these teams, and you certainly don't want to be going out in this round, especially if you're a team that, you know, wants to go to Worlds and wants to at least have the chance to be able to play your way there, which I'm pretty sure everybody left does. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Of course, if you're new here, what we do on this channel is we go game by game in each series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'm going to give a player of the game and a dud of the game for every single individual game. At the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of talk about just how the teams are moving. And then at the end of this episode, I'm going to be previewing the third round of LPL action. I'm going to talk about who I would predict in each series and where I think things are going to go. Also worth noting, I talked about the iCard a little bit before. Up in the iCard right now as well is going to be my LPL playoff primer video that I released about a week ago. And in that video, I go over every single LPL playoff team in depth, and that is going to include the ones in the games here today. And so if you want my full thoughts on every team in the playoffs, you can go ahead and check that out as well. But with all that out of the way, it's time to jump into some LPL playoff action. And our first series of round 2 was a really interesting one. I was very intrigued to see how this would end up turning out because I actually think both of these teams are incredibly similar in terms of skill level. We had a matchup between the number 5 seeded Oh My God and the number 8 seeded Edward Gaming. A really intriguing matchup on paper. OMG has really overperformed expectations all year, or at least everyone's expectations that weren't mine at the beginning of the year. I think I had them number 6 in my preseason power rankings all the way back in like January, and things have really not changed all that much for me when it comes to that. They were still, you know, pretty close to that going into the playoffs, and so I feel like I was pretty spot on with this team, but EDG has really fluctuated a lot throughout the year. Of course, they were able to take down WE in the first round of the playoffs, which is a big win for them. WE is certainly not the worst team in the entire world. They were a competitive team, and EDG, I think, definitely looked like the better team there. Really, it's not about the talent level for EDG. It's really just been about putting it together in a big package, right? We know all these players are good, but they've struggled to play together as a unit. We've seen a couple of problems in terms of late game team fighting and peeling for their carries and communication and yada yada yada. If they can get on the same page, if they can be in a position where they can actually, you know, get the best out of all of their players, they could still be a team that genuinely competes to win the LPL. Like, they really are that talented. It's just they haven't exactly played up to that level. OMG is kind of the opposite. They very much thrive on really good teamwork. Like, yes, they do have incredibly talented players. Shanji is a ridiculously talented top laner. Aki is a very talented jungler. Abel, mechanically speaking, is fantastic. PP God, Cream are very good players, but OMG, I think, really thrives because they are a unit, and so kind of a clash of styles here. I think EDG is probably the more talented team. I think OMG is probably the more complete team from an overall perspective, and so, like I said in my playoff primer video when I did my full bracket prediction, I really do believe that this series could go either way. I ended up picking EDG in that full bracket prediction. I'm gonna stick to that prediction. I think the talent will win out. This team is just simply too good to be going out this early in the tournament, in my opinion. A lot of people would say the same thing about OMG, but I think I've honestly kind of flipped on that argument. I think OMG is exactly who I said they were all year long, which is about the 6th best team in the entire league. I think a team like EDG should be better than them, but it's really going to be up to whether or not EDG can play up to their strengths in this series, in my opinion. If they play like they did in the regular season, they're probably going to lose, and if they play better than they did, they're probably going to win. That really is just how it is for me, but we get to jump into the games and check out whether or not that team is going to be able to show up and prove to everybody that they are as talented as they should be, or if OMG is going to say, no, we are actually a team that deserves to be in the World's qualification cycle, even though not a lot of people predicted us to be there. So let's go ahead and go over it. And of course, we got to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was OMG. They are able to take the first game of this series, a very important first game. We talk about momentum so much when it comes to League of Legends because I really do believe that almost more than any other like traditional competitive environment, whether that be traditional sports or other esports, like momentum and confidence matters so much in League of Legends. Being able to definitively and decisively make the plays that you think are right is so much more important than being able to make the 100% right decision, I guess you could say, every single time. You always want to be together as a unit. It's better to make a bad decision together as 5 than to make a good decision separated with 2 people and 3 people doing different things, right? That's just always going to be the case in League of Legends. You're going to be stronger when you're all on the same page, and I think that was absolutely the case here, and that confidence and that ability to play like that is something that OMG, I think, has really, really done well throughout this year, and honestly, OMG winning game 1 is not pretty typical for this team. They were notorious for losing game number 1s in the best of 3 stage of the regular season, and they still were able to come out on top and win towards the back half of series. So to be able to see them take the first game of this series, very, very impressive stuff. Player of the game for me is going to go to Cream in the mid lane. This one was not a difficult decision. He really was fantastic in this first game of the series, which you really want to see. I'm not going to say that Cream was a little bit disappointing this split, but I just wasn't as blown away by him as I was really wanting to be. When I was looking at OMG last year or in 2021 or basically at any point in the last few years, I really identified Cream as the player that I thought was going to be the one to push them over the top as someone to continue to grow and become one of the best mid laners in the world. I think he has the talent to be able to do that. I just don't think it's necessarily clicked in the same way. That really has become Shanji for this team. He's been the one that's been like the main carry and the one that's pushed them over the top, in my opinion. Cream has still been good for this team, but I don't think he's been a superstar. This was a superstar level performance in the playoffs, and that's what you want to see. He dominated the early laning phase on the strongest pick in the meta right now in Tristana, which we know he can play well. Obviously, OMG loves this Tristana pick. You have Abel's, arguably 2 best AD carries in this game with the Tristana and the Samira, which we will get to, but Cream can pull that into the mid lane and really make good use of it, and I thought he really dominated this one. This was a fantastic performance, and if he's going to be able to play like this the entire series, that's going to really up OMG's potential and their ability to win a lot of these games. And then I think the other players that you got to shout out, Shanji in the top lane on Cassante. Obviously, he's just a really, really good player. He's the best player on OMG. I don't even think that's really all that debatable. Aki is certainly in that conversation for me as well, and what PP God does off the Rift and, communication-wise for this team is obviously very massive, but Shanji's the big carry of this team, and you put him on something like Cassante that is just so strong and so useful in so many different circumstances, he's gonna be able to capitalize and make that champion look as strong as it is, and so really good stuff from the solo laners of OMG. Those are the 2 players that I think you really want to see step up and dominate. Aki was definitely the better jungler in this game, had a ton of pressure on the Maokai, and Jeje was not very good, which we will get to in a bit. The bot lane really wasn't all that relevant. Abel really didn't have to do all that much on his signature Samira pick. Kind of fun to see him go to this in game number 1. A lot of teams have even gone as far as to ban the Samira against OMG just because of how good Abel is on it. Wasn't necessarily the biggest factor in this game, but I like the idea of going towards this very aggressive bot lane combo of like a Samira Galio. 2 picks we're really just not seeing at all, basically at any point in the meta. Galio support is a major, major question mark for me in terms of picking it. I think it's pretty bad, but in this particular circumstance, I think PP God played it at a pretty high level, and so who am I to complain? But Shanji and Cream, I think, were the standouts, and I think PP God was probably the other player that you really saw as having a good game on OMG. And then for EDG, you kind of got run over in this one, to be entirely honest. It felt like a lot of the macro pieces for this team were just not there, and this was a concern for them going into this series, is that, as talented as they are, if they get behind, they don't really have a lot of tools to be able to get back other than just outplaying their opponents, and you're not going to be able to consistently outplay the players on OMG from behind. Like, if they have more gold, they're arguably just as talented as you are, and so you really need to be able to go out there and generate leads early, and EDG just really was not able to do that in this game. Dud of the game was actually kind of difficult. I think I'm going to give it to Mako on the Rel. A couple of those engages just not necessarily working out. Rel is a champion right now that I think is incredibly strong, and obviously a lot of people are starting to gravitate towards it, but Jeje on the Sejuani was also really bad, in my opinion. Just kind of a lot of the setup pieces for EDG not necessarily there. Fofo was dealing no damage on the Akali. That's Cream's quote-unquote signature pick, almost a takeaway there. Not necessarily worth it if Fofo's just going to go down to the strongest mid laner in the game at the moment. And then Ale picking Camille. I don't really love Camille in the current meta. Like, I understand that Jackson, Renekton, and Fiora were all banned out, which are all just kind of the better versions of Camille. But I do think that there are more picks that you can go to. We've seen things like the Olaf or the Aatrox, I think, be a little bit more proactive. Hell, even something like the Gwen was still left up, and I really would have liked that in this instance. Maybe you would have been a little bit too AP heavy with the Akali, the Kai'Sa, and then the Gwen, but just something to consider. I just don't think Camille is the pick in this circumstance. But Jeje and Mako, I think, were definitely the biggest standouts in terms of not performing well. That's kind of been a little bit of a trend for this team in the regular season, but they were actually both really good in their first round playoff series, and this is just game one, so I don't want to sit here and try to overreact. This was a stomp win from OMG, but you got to be able to keep that momentum up. Winning game one is great, but you got to win 3 games in this series. The first one is just the first one. You got to be able to carry that momentum in. So is OMG going to be able to carry that momentum, or is EDG going to say, okay, it was just game one, we're going to be able to bounce back, and we're going to tie the series up? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Edward Gaming. They are able to take the second game of this series. They're able to tie it up at 1 apiece, and this is the kind of back and forth series that we wanted. I talked about these two teams really having an interesting dynamic going into each other in terms of play styles, and I wanted to see them both shine in this. I think both teams deserve to be here at this point in the playoffs, and I really didn't want to see a blowout. I didn't want to see one team disappoint way more than expected. I wanted to see both teams go back and forth, and I think at least through the first 2 games, it very much has been back and forth. Game 1, very OMG favored, 23-minute win. Game 2, very EDG favored in a 25-minute win. So good stuff coming in from both teams. Really liked what EDG was able to do, basically just kind of, I would say, simplifying the process a little bit for them. Taking, the lessons they learned in game number 1, getting some more power picks on their side, and then using counter pick to actually be able to put themselves in a good position to stop a lot of the advantages that OMG in particular wanted to generate. You might look at this and be like, oh, this is a great Malphite game for Shanji, and you're right, but I would argue the best pick in this draft was the Braum coming in for EDG and for Mako, which just completely shut down so much of what OMG actually wanted to do in this game. Braum could sit there and tank Kai'Sa W's all day long and not worry about it. Basically, for any moment, you could, have Braum to eat the hook from Nautilus and really stop a lot of the engage threat. Really, there was a lot of things that Braum did this game that were super, super positive, and for that, Mako is actually going to get my player of the game. I think Broadcast ended up giving it to Jeje. I think Uzi should definitely be in the conversation for it as well. Fofo had a really good game on the Tristana. Everybody on EDG really did play well, but Mako, to me, was the most noticeably good in this game. Again, I understand why, people on the internet are so low on Mako and so out on Mako at the current moment. He hasn't exactly had the best summer split, especially for his standards. He's been basically the best support in the LPL for many years now, 2 or 3 years now. He's been a very, very good player and, is one of, if not the greatest support in LPL history, but it's kind of been a little bit of a slow summer split for him. Him and Uzi haven't exactly had the best of chemistry, and he really didn't work well with Leave at the beginning of the split before Uzi came on anyways, and so it's just kind of been a little bit topsy-turvy, I would say, for him. A lot of people are complaining about him being the starting support for Team China in the Asian games. I've already explained on this channel why I don't think that narrative really makes all that much sense. Whatever. I'm not gonna rehash it here. It's fine. Mako's a really good player, and he offers more than just whatever form he's in on the Rift, and that's all I'll say here. But he's been really good in the playoffs for this team. He was awesome in round number 1 against WE. Arguably the best player on the team. I think it was between him, Uzi, Ale, right? Like, even Jeje. Like, everybody played well in round number 1. I think I gave player of the series to Ale, but Mako was definitely in the conversation, and another really good game, too, here. He wasn't as clinical in game number 1, but the rest of the team was also not very good. I think the Braum pick was just incredibly useful. Uzi did a great job, executing, I think, on a lot of the things that were set up. A lot of the setup was done by Jeje on the Sejuani this game. He was so active on the map, really moving around, trying to create advantages. When you're a Sejuani and you go deathless in a game with, 16 kills participated in, that's pretty damn good. That's a really, really good game, and I think Jeje definitely showed up. If Mako was the one that was really enabling them to play super aggressive, Jeje was the one capitalizing on a lot of that aggression by going super deep and trying to make a lot of plays and really trying to expedite the process, and I think he did it in a really good way. Of course, Uzi dealing the damage. Fofo was dealing a lot of damage on a super broken Tristana pick. Honestly, I've said this multiple times throughout the split, like way before this series, way before even the playoffs started. Tristana needs to be like a permaban, in my opinion, against basically any good aggressive mid laner. Both Fofo and Cream definitely qualify for that kind of conversation, because if you give, Fofo or Cream Tristana, like, they just have so many more more tools than basically any other mid laner in the game. I think Jace has kind of taken that route where it's like, yes, Jace is incredibly strong and he's now getting permabanned. I think Tristana needs to be on that list for me as well on red side. It's got to be something that you can't really allow on blue side with first pick because it really just is incredibly efficient and incredibly consistent. That's really, I think, the thing that is most scary about Tristana is you kind of know that it's going to be relevant basically every game, both early and late. Ale was good in the top lane. Everything just kind of worked for EDG. Everybody playing well. And then for OMG on the other side, not exactly the same as game number 1. You weren't able to get that early lead. You weren't able to dominate the early laning phase because you didn't quite have the same kind of tools that you did in game number 1, and that's okay. But again, EDG's the kind of team where if they generate a lead, they're talented enough to be able to close the game out relatively quickly, and OMG really had no business catching up in this game. Like, they were not close to being relevant. Cream was really the only one who was dealing damage, but even then, he really wasn't dealing, like, efficient damage. He didn't exactly have the best game in the world. Fofo was definitely the better mid laner in this one. My dead of the game, though, is going to go to Abel in the bot lane. This is just another one of those games coming out from Abel. He's going to have these every once in a while, especially on a more aggressive champion like Kai'Sa that does kind of need to be in your face a little bit towards the back half of games to deal as much damage as she needs to do. He just got caught out way too often. He was getting hit by Xayah feathers super consistently, even though sometimes it was a little bit questionable whether or not they were actually there. There was one, I think, in the bot lane where Uzi ends up pulling back feathers, and it definitely does not look like 3 feathers hit Kai'Sa, but she gets stunned anyways. I'm not going to talk about how this game doesn't work. I'm just going to talk about how I think Abel didn't necessarily play all that well, and it is kind of a little bit of a trend for him that not when he's not on his specific champions, because he can play well on the Kai'Sa, but when things aren't going well, they go like much more poorly, I would say, than any other of the quote-unquote top 80 carries in the LPL at the current moment, and I think this was a good example of that. The Nautilus was completely irrelevant, having to go into the Braum, which basically shut everything he wanted down. Shanji and Aki did nothing, even though the Malphite was going into a full AD comp. You would have really hoped that that pick would neutralize a lot of the advantages that EDG was able to get, but they just got too much gold in the early game for the Malphite to ever really be relevant, and so, OMG ends up falling. But again, it's only game 2. The series is now tied up at 1 apiece, and we've seen OMG be able to weather the storm and be able to come back and win series in the past. That's basically how they've gotten here in the playoffs, is losing game number 1 and then winning games 2 and 3 in the regular season. So moving into game number 3, it's going to be a very important one. Being able to establish tempo in this series is going to be massive because, again, like I said multiple times, I really don't think there is a massive difference between these two teams. But for EDG, you're hoping that this game 2 can build a lot of the confidence. If you can continue to get some of those early game leads, I really do think that you can translate a lot of that into wins, and I think that's probably going to be your most efficient path to victory. So are they going to be able to do that in game 3, or is OMG going to be able to get back on top in this series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was OMG. They are able to take game number 3. They're able to take a 2-1 series lead here, and this game was much, much closer. There was definitely some fight coming in from both of these teams, but OMG just kind of being better. They made a lot of the good plays, and they made a lot of the bad plays in this game, but at the very least, they were the one that really was making a lot of the plays this game, and I think the good ones really sealed their fate and got them the win in this one. In EDG, just kind of along for the ride. A couple of picks that I'm really not a huge fan of at the current moment. Just one. I'll talk about the Vayne in a bit, and I get it, it's Uzi Vayne, but you can't really pick Vayne. It's not very good right now, and even though you're going into something like Kai'Sa that I think Vayne can play into, it's just not nearly as good late game as I think a lot of the other hyper carries are at the current moment, and you're very susceptible to heavy engage, which is what we saw from the side of OMG, and we'll get into that in a bit, but OMG actually did play really, really well, and I want to give them a lot of credit for that. This game was really back and forth for a lot of the back half of this game. OMG was in a relatively decent spot in the early game, but couldn't quite hang on to that gigantic lead, and there were moments where it was like, oh, maybe Uzi is going to be able to take over because he's good. Jejez actually playing really well on the Sejuani. A lot of damage coming out from the LeBlanc, et cetera, et cetera. All in a side lane. There were a lot of things that I think were on the table for EDG to be able to push forward. Cream was kind of struggling with some of the ultimates in the mid game, but eventually it all comes down to one massive engage from Aki here on the Rel, and then all of a sudden EDG is gone. I don't know where they went. They all got instantly deleted, and so really good stuff from Aki. He's going to get my player of the game here in game number 3. I think he's honestly flown a little bit under the radar in terms of how good he's been for OMG. Hasn't quite been as much of a standout, in my opinion, as he was in spring, where it was just like, oh my god, is he like an MVP candidate? Because he really was phenomenal in in spring, but I went out on a limb and said that he was going to be able to sustain being one of the better junglers in the LPL, and he has so far, at least in summer. He's been very, very good. I think at worst, he's a top 5 jungler in the LPL at the current moment. I think that's a relatively fair statement to make, and he really was pretty fantastic in this game. That Rel engage single-handedly won them the game. I know that there were a lot of other things that this team did really right throughout this game, but that Rel engage is really what I think a lot of people are going to remember, and he's going to deserve player of the game for that. If they don't make that play, then they don't win the game, and I think that's good enough to be able to get the player of the game for me. I think the other players to shout out, Abel on the Kai'Sa, basically the exact opposite of what he did in game number 2. Sometimes those aggressive plays work, and sometimes they don't. In game 2, he never really had the prio to be able to make it work. Once he got behind early, it wasn't necessarily going to happen. He doesn't play well from behind, but when he got ahead on the Kai'Sa, like he did in this game, he was able to do a ton of damage in the team fights, and he was a big reason why a lot of those engages from the Rel and from the Rakan were followed up on really well. I think Cream is in a very similar boat, kind of the feast or famine game coming in from Cream. He was awesome in game 1. In game 3, it's been a little bit more, divisive in terms of what he's been able to do. I like him on Yone. I think it's a very good pick for him, but sometimes he hits the ultimates and sometimes he doesn't. He had a couple of really bad ones this game, but he also had a couple of terrific ones that ended up winning some team fights for them. So just the dichotomy of having a player like Cream that can be a little bit more volatile on the team. Sometimes you get the really good plays, sometimes you get the bad plays, and you're going to have to take both. Shanji was relatively fine on the Poppy, but overall I would say OMG did play really well. This was Aki's game in terms of that big engage, but Abel and Cream playing well, PP God playing well, and OMG able to take control of this series here, which is just oh so important. And then for EDG on the other side of the map, I mean, you tried your best. You did really, really well towards the beginning part of this game. So when you look at this comp, that's kind of the positive takeaway, and we've been talking about how important it is for EDG to win early. And they did in this game. They had a massive lead that they just weren't able to hang on to, but a lot of that just comes down to not being able to teamfight nearly as efficiently as what OMG was able to do. And I think you could kind of expect that with this comp. A lot of really easy tools to use on the side of OMG. The Rel engage, the Rakan follow-up, the Yone, the Kai'Sa. You know, when these guys are able to get gold on top of them, they're able to fight relatively efficiently and really without a lot of trouble. EDG, I think, takes a little bit more patience and a little bit more, you know, back and forth in order to win in that same vein. And yes, that was a little bit of a pun because my dud of the game is going to go to Uzi on this vein. I just don't like this pick. I think it was a big reason why they ended up losing this game. I get it. It's Uzi Vayne, and it's the classic pick, and he's played it in the regular season, and he's looked relatively okay on it. But I think if you have an AD carry that can consistently teamfight in this game a little bit safer than what the Vayne has to offer, not necessarily put himself in as much of a risky spot, I think you just straight up win this game. I don't think that OMG really ever has the chance to be able to get onto your backline and deal with it, but their team fight was so poor because it was so inconsistent throughout a lot of the back half of this game that they really had no shot, and I'm going to blame that on the AD carry. I'm not going to say it's entirely Uzi's fault and how he played, but it is, you know, kind of his fault in terms of the fact that if he wasn't on Vayne, I think it would have been a lot better. I don't think Mako played particularly well on the Nautilus, but I don't think he played poorly either. I think it was just a lot of not really being able to peel because of the AoE engage coming out from the side of OMG. Fofo could have done more damage. I think Ale could have been more inside lanes. JJ was actually pretty good this game. He had a great early game. He was the big reason why EDG was actually ahead for a majority of this early game, getting Uzi quite a bit of gold in the early game, but they just weren't able to sustain it, and that's frustrating. And for EDG, you gotta hope that you don't let that linger on your mind. They're a good team that should be able to compete in this series, but you can't say like, oh, we should have won Game 3 and now go into Game 4 with lowered confidence and lower expectations. You need to be able to just forget about this and say like, hey, we had a lead for a majority of this game. We just weren't able to close it out. If we do a lot of the same things and we're just a little bit more clinical towards the back half of the game, then we're going to be able to win this series. You have to have that mentality or else it's going to be doomed. And then for OMG, you've kind of proven that no matter the game state, you're going to be able to win some games in this series. So you only need one more. You've got 2 more games and you've only got to win one of them, and you're going to be moving on not only to the next round, but you're going to officially qualify yourself for the regional qualifiers towards the back half of this split, giving yourself an opportunity to play at the World Championships. That's a major deal for an organization that's basically been nowhere close ever since, you know, like 2015 or 2014, you know, way back in the day. And so you're really hoping to see OMG kind of pull that off, and for EDG, you're really hoping to see them turn it around, but it's do or die for EDG as we head in to the 4th game of this series. Are they going to be able to win it, or is their season going to come to a bittersweet end today? Well, we're going to find out now, because the winner of game number 4 was Edward Gaming. They are able to take game number 4. They're able to even up this series at 2 apiece, and man, did they need to do this. This was a little bit more rocky than maybe it would appear on, you know, on paper when you look at the stats. 24-10 in kills, 8-3 in towers, you know, 7k gold lead. Like, this looks like a game that EDG was really, really strong in, but the one thing that this graphic does show, 2 Barons over to the side of OMG, and they certainly tried to make it close. Cream was doing so much damage in this game, and he was so important that when he decided to insta-lose the game by ulting in and just dying immediately, like, it really did matter for OMG. We'll get to him in a little bit, but let's talk about EDG first and foremost. Player of the game for me is going to go to Ale in the top lane. Really, really good performance from him on the Jax, and honestly, he's just been so good throughout the playoffs. Basically, every time that he's been in them for every team that he's been on, LNG, now EDG, he's just been a really good, really nice playoff performer. He's been good at Worlds as well, and so maybe he just likes the big games, the games that matter the most. It really does feel like he's making his case to re-enter that conversation as the top laner in the LPL. He was definitely in that conversation, if not leading that conversation in spring, but hadn't exactly been the best of summer splits. You know, EDG in general just wasn't clicking in the same way, and so I think a lot of people started to forget about him in that conversation, but he was really, really fantastic in this one on the Jax, being able to create a ton of pressure, not only in the side lane, but those flanks, those engages coming out from the Jax to get on what is kind of a squishy midline here from OMG of the Kai'Sa and of the Xayah. And so, you know, obviously Xayah can peel for herself, but the Kai'Sa can be a little bit susceptible to that. And, you know, the K'Sante really wasn't all that relevant in this game. And so a lot of opportunities for the Jax to actually be able to do his thing. And he did do his thing. He had a really good game. Uzi doing a lot of damage in this one. I think a lot of people are going to point to his good plays. He had just as many bad plays. This was honestly kind of a solo Q80 carry experience coming out from Uzi, where it would be like, you know, some plays it's like he's positioning really well, and then others he's just walking up, being really greedy, trying to get a kill and dies for it. You know, it's Uzi. You know, you're going to allow those plays to happen, but he's not been the most clinical of AD carries across this playoff run so far. Can sometimes get himself into a little bit of trouble by pushing up a little bit too far, but I guess I would rather see that than to see him not trying to make plays and not trying to be an active positive for his team. I would much rather see him go down swinging, I guess you could say. JJ with a really good game. Fofo I thought was underratedly really solid on the LeBlanc throughout this one, and Mako with some good engages on the Nautilus. Just a couple of moments where Uzi was a little bit far forward, and, you know, their macro game is still very questionable, especially in the mid game. They were just giving up way too much to the side of OMG. They really had no business allowing OMG to get back into this game like they did, but either way, they were able to close it out. One massive mistake from OMG ends up closing out the game, and that's enough to give EDG the win, and it keeps their season alive. A really important win, obviously, for them here. But you do still got to give a lot of credit to the team. Even though it was a little bit of a major mistake by OMG that caused them to, you know, easily get back in here, you still have to be able to perform, and for the most part, they were the better team in this game. So I do want to give them credit, even if there are a lot of things that I think they can clean up in a performance like this. But for OMG on the other side, you're going to be so frustrated in this one. You got to give a lot of credit to Cream. I know people are going to be, you know, very much hating on him, and I understand it. He made the game-losing play, and that's got to be an incredibly disappointing thing, and really, I don't know why he made that play. There really was no explanation. Sometimes you just see an avenue, maybe, you know, see red, see a couple kills in your eyes, and you go for it, and don't realize the risk to the game that it does end up taking on that Kai'Sa ultimate. But before that, he was so integral to why that team was in the game in the first place, why they were able to compete and kind of come back and fight over a lot of these objectives in the first place. So yes, I understand that the game-losing play is disastrous, but he's not going to get my dud of the game for it, because again, he was actually really good outside of that. He did the second most damage of anybody in the game, only behind Fofo on that LeBlanc, and it's impressive stuff. He was the artillery mage in this game, and those Kai'Sa W's absolutely were hurting. It felt like he got bored and decided to go in and try to make the hero play, and that's what ended up costing him, and that's been a problem for Cream, is, you know, going a little bit too deep sometimes, being a little bit too aggressive, and that was the case here. But dud of the game for me is going to go to Aki in the jungle. Not a very good Poppy game overall. I think that, you know, sometimes Poppy as a champion isn't going to be as useful as you would think it would be on paper. Poppy actually is pretty good into this team comp. You look at, you know, basically everybody except for the Jinx on the enemy team, and you're like, Poppy actually shuts them down really hard, and even the Jinx really has trouble getting through Poppy in the late game. But Aki, I don't think pathed particularly well in the early game. JJ was able to generate a lot of advantages, and so he was playing from the back foot basically the entire game, and he never really had all that much of an impact. I think you could realistically give dud of the game here to Shanji in the top lane as well on the K'Sante. Not a very good K'Sante game. Ale was significantly better in this game, and it's kind of been of a trend in this series. Ale's been the better top laner. I think you could give it to PP God on the Leona. Don't particularly like Leona in the current meta. I think as an engager, she's one of the weaker ones in the current kind of crop of supports. I still understand why teams, specifically LPL teams, are prioritizing her, because I do think she synergizes well with some of the other AD carries that are rising in popularity, but I would much rather have the Rel or the Nautilus or the Rakan or something like that. Obviously, Rakan and Rel banned out this game, the Nautilus taken away. way, not a ton of other engage options, but, you know, I think it's unfortunate when you get pushed down that far into the tree. I think Leona is definitely a step down, and I think we saw that in this one, but again, a lot of people are just going to look at the cream play and say, you know, that's where OMG lost the game. I think OMG lost the game in a couple of different moments, and I think the cream play was just the one that was the most obvious. They definitely need to clean a lot of things up. Their early game wasn't very good. They certainly weren't clinical in trying to make any sort of aggressive plays in the mid game, and then obviously some major mistakes towards the back half. But they did show in this game that they have the talent to be able to win. I think that they really are just a piece off, but it's win or go home now. Game 5, do or die, silver scrapes. We are here. The first game 5 of the LPL playoffs, and man, I'm excited to go over it. Is OMG going to be able to take it and prove that as the upper seed and as the young guns here in the LPL playoffs that they are here for real? Or is EDG going to say, we're finally starting to get our shit together and we are a team that you absolutely have to watch out for? One of these teams is going to be moving on, and the winner of that and the winner of game number 5 was Edward Gaming. They are able to take game number 5. They're able to close out this series, and they are going to be moving on into round number 3 here. And unfortunately, with this loss for OMG, this officially concludes their 2023 split. Technically, they're in 6th place right now in terms of championship points for regional qualification, but the winner of the series that we'll talk about right after this, Weibo Gaming versus Ninjas and Pyjamas, will overtake them, or at the very least tie them in terms of championship points, and Summer takes precedent in terms of that. So their season ends in this game number 5. They've definitely got to be disappointed. We'll get to them in a second, but congratulations to EDG, another round 1 team that goes on to make a run in the LPL playoffs. It feels like there's at least one of these every single split, a team that finishes somewhere in the bottom 4 of the playoff teams that is just much better and really shouldn't have been there in the first place. And we all kind of knew EDG was that team, or at least on talent, you know, was that team going into the tournament, but they're living up to that talent. Taking down OMG is certainly not a light accomplishment for this team, but they did it. And they did it in really, really good fashion. A lot of these players playing incredibly well. And this was a dominant win for the team. There were 2 dominant wins from EDG in this series. Game 2 and Game 5 were both rather dominant wins for them, and you've got to be excited for what this team can do when everything is working. At the very least, they're going to have their shot of going to the World Championships. And I think with this level of talent, you've got to be excited for that. Player of the game for me in game number 5, and player of the series overall is going to go to Mako in the support position. I know we had a couple of up and down games. Game 1 wasn't great. Game 3 wasn't perfect. You know, the 2 losses I don't think were ideal, but sometimes in a support position, you're going to have some bad games when you are losing, especially in a meta where engaged supports really are kind of everything. But Galio, Maokai, things being pulled out in that role that other people around the world just aren't prioritizing all that highly. The only other Maokai support I can remember in recent weeks was Chime over in the LCS, but he got absolutely obliterated. We saw the weaknesses of that pick. Mako made it look completely broken in this game. Easy choice for player of the game, and I think he was the most impactful member of EDG in this series as a whole. I think a lot of people are going to give it to Jeje as well. Even Ale, I think, deserves to be in that conversation, but to me, it's either Mako or Jeje. I think the advantages that they were able to create were absolutely massive. Jeje had another really good game on the Sejuani here. He just generates pressure so effortlessly. Aki actually played relatively well this game. You can see that in his scoreline, but Jeje always had control of the map. He was the better jungler across this whole series, and that's what he should be. That's what he needs to be. He should be a top 3 jungler in the LPL. It's Jeje. Like, he absolutely has the pedigree to fall into that role. It hasn't necessarily worked out for him as much as maybe you would want it to over the last few weeks, but he's starting to get his form back, and I thought he really was fantastic against a good OMG team, but Mako as well. I think if he's going to step it up, if Jeje's going to step it up, those are the 2 players that you really want to see kind of emerge as big carries for this team. Ale's in the same boat. We'll get to him in a second, but if those 2 pieces, the more facilitators on this team, can step up and be massive positives and be, you know, what we know they can be, this is going to be one of the best teams in the LPL. They have that potential, and they kind of showed it here. I thought Ale, again, was really good. Top side of the map was a massive strength for EDG across this whole series. I don't think Shanji was as bad as maybe some of his score lines would indicate, but Ale was really, really good. He just always steps up his game in the playoffs, and this was another example of that. Fofo was solid. All he had to do was not be a problem this series. They didn't really give him a lot of, you know, picks that he needed to dominate on, except for that Tristana in game number 2, which was really good. But, you know, other than that, he just needed to be a good team fighter for this team. That's what they asked of him, and he did that. He did that at a relatively good level, and that's what he does relatively well. He's a great team fighter. He's pretty much been a great team fighter all year long, even if people on the internet don't like to tell you that. And then Uzi continued to be good, a little bit over-aggressive in this series, sometimes got himself into some trouble. This was probably the most kind of volatile series that he's had in the LPL this year up until this point, but still a lot of positive plays, and I thought the Kai'Sa here in Game 5 was really good. So EDG just looking really solid. You're really happy for this team to move on, and the upside of them is absolutely there now. And then for OMG, it's a very disappointing way for your season to end. I think a lot of people really wanted to see this team do a lot better. I will dominate some crying in a corner at the current moment, and I feel, obviously, rip Dom, but I like this OMG team a lot. I've talked about it a lot on this channel. Unfortunately, a couple of these players just didn't really step up today. My dud of the game is going to go to Kareem, and he's going to get a lot of hate for this series. I think a lot of it's going to be unjustified. Some of it is going to be justified because he made the game-losing error in Game 4. I hate to call it that because really there is no one play that loses you the game in League of Legends. It's very rare for something like that to happen because if you play perfectly up until, your one disastrous play, then you're actually going to be in a position to win the game, and it's not like his teammates were playing well in Game 4. He was the one who got them there, but he did make that mistake towards the back half of Game 4, and then he didn't play particularly well in Game 5. He's going to get a lot of hate for this, but I really don't think this series is on him, or at least exclusively on him. Shanji was outplayed in the top lane. Again, I don't think he was as bad as people would say, but he's been the big carry for this team, and he didn't really step up in this series. There were no games where Shanji really stood out as being particularly great. Maybe Game 1, but everybody in Game 1 was looking good. Aki was okay across this series. Was probably the best player on OMG across the 5 games, but, it wasn't by, a whole ton. And Abel and PP just kind of were there. Did Abel have a good game at any point in this series? The Ezreal was a completely useless pick, was dealing absolutely no damage towards the back half of this game, and PP God's engages on the rel were also very much not working out. It's not like it was one player who lost for OMG, even though that's going to be the prevailing narrative is the mistakes that Cream made, which I feel really bad for because, I don't think he deserves it across this series, but it is going to be, I think, the narrative that people take away. But I think OMG had such a positive season overall. This was a team that, for as good as they had done in previous years, they made playoffs last year. They were, relatively decent as a 9th, 10th place team, right? But this was a legitimate Worlds contender for most of this year, and I think that's major improvement for a lot of young players who have never really been in that situation before. Everybody except for PP God on this team is very inexperienced, and for them to be as consistent as they were all year long, you got to take away from 2023 that this was a positive. It's going to be interesting to see what direction they go in next year, but I really do think they're going to be happy with the output that they had here. But congratulations to EDG. They're going to be moving on. We'll preview their series at the end of the video, but this was only the first series of round number 2. It's time to jump in to the second one. And now we do get to move on to that second series in this video. We just saw an incredibly competitive best of 5 between two very good teams. I'm very interested to see how this one goes. I think on paper it's a little bit more of a mismatch than that first series was, but that's kind of what we said about the first round matchup, and it didn't necessarily go as according to plan. So let's go ahead and go over this series. We had a matchup between the number 6 seeded Weibo Gaming and the number 10 seeded Ninjas in Pyjamas. Really happy to see NIP here. This team upsetting RNG in the first round. Kind of upsetting. I think I was more willing to say that they were going to win in round 1 than maybe, a team like WE over EDG. I really had a lot of faith that NIP actually matched up relatively interestingly against RNG. I still wasn't picking them in that series, as you guys know in the playoff preview, but really like how Shadow and Angel in particular have been playing, and NIP has shown that if Photic and Juo can step up, that can be a relatively good bot lane as well, and so there are definitely some positives, but it is a completely different test going from RNG to Weibo Gaming. It's a completely different level in terms of the talent on this team. Weibo is a very good team. They are incredibly talented. They are a Worlds caliber team in terms of their best. They've been able to beat some of the scarier teams in the entire league. They've beaten JD Gaming. They have beaten LNG over the course of this year, and not a lot of teams are going to be able to say that, and so they're certainly going to be favorites going into this series. I think when you're looking at any series with Weibo, it really is going to come down to which version of that team does end up showing up, because as we know, at their best, they're one of the best teams in the entire world, but they can lose to anybody. We've also seen that there are so many bottom tier teams that this team has just not been able to overcome over the course of this split. I'm not sure it's because they just mentally check out, or maybe they're just not prepping, or they try to test out more unique drafts and picks against worse teams. I don't know what it is, but pretty consistently, this Weibo team has, just been a little bit feast or famine, born to win trade. That's the moniker, right? And it's been this org, so gonna be interesting if they can overcome NIP. I think whichever version of Weibo shows up, that's gonna determine how this series ends up going. If you get the good version of Weibo, I think that they're just better than NIP, but there is no guarantee that that's what you're gonna get, and NIP is more than good enough to be able to capitalize on a team that isn't playing at their best, and so we get to go over the games now. We get to, of course, start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Weibo Gaming. They are able to take the first game in this series, and man, we wondered if we were going to get the good version of them. We certainly did in the first game of this series, because this was a dominant win coming out from this team. Multiple players that I think you could really point out and say they showed up and they played well. I think that there are a couple that I think I'm going to highlight in terms of player of the game nominees. One I'm going to give it to, obviously, but really at the end of the day, this entire team I think played incredibly well, both in and out of lane. And I think all of them deserve credit for what they were able to do on the Rift today. Player of the game for me was a really tough decision. I'm going to give it to Light in the bot lane. Thought he was really good on the Ezreal. We've seen so many people pull out this champion. Not so many. We've seen a couple of people pull out this champion over the course of this year in multiple different regions and just not really be able to perform all that well. It doesn't feel like Ezreal's in that good of a state, but Light made it feel incredibly strong in this game. If you're the better AD carry, you're going to be able to show it on a champion like Ezreal, and Light is definitely the better AD carry in this series. I know people still really want to hang on to the idea that Fodek can be like a top ADC in the LPL. I'm not on that bandwagon. I haven't been on that bandwagon at any point in his career. I think Light is someone that I've always been very high on, and he's showing it right now, at least in this first game. A really good performance on Ezreal, going into a champion that honestly should be relatively good into Ezreal in the Xayah, and so like Light a lot. I thought he played really well, but Broadcast gave it to Weiwei, and I think you could absolutely do that as well. A ridiculous amount of damage coming out from this Vi. This is a champion that's been very highly prioritized by LPL teams basically all year long. I've been pretty against that idea. I don't think Vi is this pick or ban champion that a lot of LPL teams seem to think that she is. I think they really like her ability to engage and just make everything a little bit simpler, which I do understand, but there are a lot of other champions that I think do what she does just as consistently, and, I think she does have her own flaws, but Weiwei did not show any of those flaws in game number 1. Just a really good one. Was, like I said, dominating the map and dealing so much damage. Usually that champion is mostly just known for the setup, but Weiwei was making her look like a carry in this game. A very good game from him, and Weiwei's a player that I've actually been relatively low on. Not that I dislike him or anything. I think he's just been more of a cog in the machine of what Weibo Gaming has been able to do, not someone who's been dragging this team to become better. I think a lot of that has been the bottom side of the map. And speaking of, Xiaohu and Crisp, two very good players, two players that I definitely considered in my all-pro rankings. Crisp did end up getting in there as my third team player, but Xiaohu was really awesome in this game on the Azir. I think he's been underrated all split long. He's been underrated his entire career, specifically in the last 2 years or so. You see so many comments from so many different people talking about how Xiaohu is just not an elite mid laner anymore, and I could not disagree more. Watching the tape this year, I think you could still make the argument that he's the best team fighter in the world. Like, he's certainly in that conversation. He can sometimes be a little bit more streaky when it comes to his laning phases, but you get him to the back half of the game, even from like a deficit, and he's going to be able to do more with champions than other players are. It just really is how he plays the game, and I don't think there are going to be a lot of players in the world that can actually compete with him when it comes to that level, and so that's really impressive for me. Chris was really good on the Leona, that champion I don't particularly love, but I think it's more excusable into something like Blitzcrank, and then the Shy on Cassante just needed to be there. He didn't necessarily need to do too much, and he didn't do too much, which is good. Most of the time with the Shy, you're just hoping he doesn't int the game away, and so really liked what we saw from Weibo. A really nice game number 1 win. And then for NIP, they very much just looked outclassed in this game. A lot of the positive parts of NIP were not positives in this game really at all. When you're looking at why they're here really in the first place, what got them into playoffs, it's Shadow in particular and then Angel as well, who's been a really big positive, and both of them were just completely outclassed in this game. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Angel in the mid lane on that Nico. Just not a particularly good Nico performance. We've actually seen this more commonly than you would think. I know a lot of people are saying that champion is brain dead easy and that anybody can pick her up and really dominate on her, but that's not necessarily been the case. We've definitely seen the difference between good Nico players and bad Nico players, and unfortunately Shadow picking something like the Nocturne here, you've got to be able to play from a position of power on that champion, or else you're just not going to be able to do anything, because if Nocturne ults and goes all the way in and just jumps on the backline member and the backline member can just blow him up, like, then what's the point of the Nocturne? You really aren't going to be able to do anything, and that was unfortunately the case for Shadow in this one. Fodek and Juo were just kind of meh across this entire game. Like, I can understand the idea of Blitzcrank on R5, but I really don't think that into this team comp in particular, that was the right decision. I really think that you're really only reaching for the Azir in this game. You're going to hope and pray you can get on the Ezreal, but so long as Light plays well, you're never going to be able to do that. And then Fodik really didn't have a lot of opportunities to actually win post-early game on this Xayah, and so really not a lot that he could have done. Invincible was fine on the top side, but really this was a jungle mid diff. And I think that's unfortunate for NIP, because I really do believe that those are two very good players, and they've been a positive for this team basically all year long. But for NIP, how do you bounce back in game 2? You simply have to get more advantages in the early game. You went for a very volatile draft in this game, the Nocturne, the Nico, the Blitzcrank, even something like the Fiora, which wasn't as much of a problem, but go for something a little bit easier to execute on. Go for something a little bit simpler in terms of how the game is played. I really like Azir on the other side, and I think it gave Weibo everything they needed without introducing a lot of the risks, and obviously they played it well. Something like that I think would really benefit NIP, and obviously getting on blue side's a big deal. We saw in the previous series 4 of the 5 games were won on blue side in round number 2, and then game 1 here, 1 on blue side, so very important to be getting on that side of the map. But for Weibo, just keep going, man. You are the better team. Like, I hate to make it that simple, but you are the more talented team. If you can continue to outpace your opponents, you're going to be able to win this series. But are they going to be able to keep doing that, or is NIP actually going to be able to fight back and tie this game up, tie this series up, I should say, at 1 apiece? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are able to take the second game of this series. They're able to tie it up at 1 apiece, and this was a much, much better game from them. Another quick one. We've actually gotten quite a few quick games in round number 2. Both of the first 2 games of this series were very quick, 23 and 24 minutes respectively, but this was a pretty cut and dry game. NIP clearly had a game plan, and it's a very good game plan against Weibo Gaming, and they executed on it. They were able to get a lot of gold from it, and then from that point onwards, they just had too much to be able to overcome, and it's not going to come as a surprise to people who have watched Weibo Gaming over the course of this split, but this was what I was worried about for this team mostly going into the playoffs, is that they really do have one very exploitable weakness that I think is going to hurt them against some of the best teams in the league. I actually think it's very similar to what LNG had last split, where, they had one specific part of the team that just wasn't going to be as dominant, and so if you take away the good parts of the team and just focus on the bad, they're not going to be able to beat you, and that was the case here, and, we'll get into that now. NIP knew the strategy of, the Shy's on something like Rumble that wants to be more aggressive in the top lane in the early game. He's going to be pushed up. He's going to be susceptible. We're going to gank him over and over and over again. And you know what? They did. They ganked him over and over again, and he died every single time because he doesn't know how to play safe. And Weibo just gave over so much gold to NIP, and there was really no way to recover that for the rest of the game. Now, it's not just the Shy's fault. I don't want to specifically blame him here, but this is a pattern for Weibo, and this is something that we've talked about a lot on this channel, is that if you can get to the Shy repeatedly, you're going to beat Weibo. Like, you're just going to be able to beat them because he's not going to lose gracefully. He's one of the players in the league that just doesn't do that. And so Shadow going top lane a lot really created a ton of advantages for himself. It got him a lot of gold, which he then translated into Angel having a lot of gold, in which case Zhuo was then becoming really active on the map because he could play with a LeBlanc. And so there were so many things that just kind of spiraled out of control because of that pressure. And you got to give a lot of credit to Shadow for it. He's going to get my player of the game. He was amazing in this one on the Lee Sin. We know he's been very good at Lee Sin. Going back to his time in the LEC, was always really good at this champion, and that continues here in the LPL. It was a really good performance, but again, this was a game plan diff. This was NIP knowing the weakness of Weibo coming in and exploiting it. Shadow's a very good player, and when he's clicking and when he's playing at a high level and he's exploiting the things that he knows he needs to exploit, he's going to dominate, and that's what he did here. Invincible obviously had to be a part of that plan. Did a good job on the Renekton to be able to set up a lot of those plays for the Lee Sin. Like I said, Shadow translating a lot of that pressure into Angel and Zhuo, and, really creating that on the map. I thought Zhuo in particular was really good on the recon after like the 10-minute mark, really unlocking his ability to move around the map and create plays for the rest of the team. Fodik was there. He didn't make any mistakes, but again, this entire game was focused on topside for NIP. He just had to be Xayah. He just had to be able to individually not lose to the Kai'Sa, not give Weibo that kind of, get out of jail free card by giving them a really strong Kai'Sa, and he did that job. I'm not going to criticize him at all. He did everything he was supposed to in this game, but this really was about Shadow stepping up and being really, really solid in this one. I want to give him a ton of credit because I really do think he played fantastic. And then for Weibo on the other side, This is the problem, man. Like, this is the concern, is that I get it. I know people love the Shy, and I know people really like him as a person and as a player, and, I like him as a person as well. By all accounts, he seems like a really good dude off the Rift. He's, it's just come out that he's been donating, like, tens of thousands of dollars to charity all year long. He seems like an awesome guy, and I don't want to disparage him. He's a really cool dude, and, he was a good player, but I feel like at this point, and I'm not singling out K-Droll or any of the other, big analysts that support the Shy as much as they do, but there is no other way to put, like, defending the Shy other than just holding on to 2018, 2019 at this point, because he's just not that player anymore. He's just not. There has been no tape, literally none, in 2023 to tell me that the Shy is still a top 10 top laner in the LPL. Like, he's a bottom half top laner by a lot, and I think it's been pretty clear. He's been the weakness for Weibo. They're not playing for him, and when he loses them the game. Like, there's no good games to balance out the bad ones. He's had good games this split, but most of them have come off the back of Weibo doing other good things on the map. He's just not that guy anymore. His lane stats have decreased immensely. He's one of the worst laners in the LPL in terms of top lane, and his team fighting has never really been, like, his strength as a player. I just don't know what he does anymore, and this was a really poor performance on the Rumble. A champion that I think myself and a lot of other people would consider incredibly broken at the current moment. So I don't know, not very good coming in from Weibo. It's not just him. Weiwei absolutely should have tried to stem the bleeding, and he didn't. A really poor game coming in from him on the Viego. Xiaohu was significantly out-pressured by Angel. Light and Crisp were fine, but again, all of the pressure for NIP was on top side, so Light and Crisp had a lot of full reign to play pretty aggressive on the bot side of the map, and they were fine in that regard, but it's not like they really did anything with it. It was just kind of a bad game for Weibo, and it really did highlight something that I think they should be worried about. It's going to be interesting to see if that ends up being a problem for them, but they're going to have to rectify that because now the series is tied up at 1-1. Again, I think it's been every series in the playoffs so far that has started 1-1. This one is no exception, and so we're going to be seeing who's going to be taking control of this by winning game number 3 and getting that confidence under their belt. Is NIP going to be able to capitalize on this strategy that they found, or is Weibo going to be able to right the ship, say, like, we've got plenty of talent on this team to be able to make up for the fact that maybe the Shy isn't really doing all that well in the top lane right now? Well, we're going to find out in game number 3 because the winner of game number 3 was Weibo Gaming. They are able to take game 3, and you know what? That big old rant that I just went on in game number 2, all the analysis, not really all that applicable to game number 3. Kind of funny how sometimes you go on a tangent when you watch a game, and then you get to the third game, and it's like, oh, actually, never mind. Pretty good outcome, I would say, overall. Maybe everything I said about game 2 doesn't necessarily apply here. I still think it applies for, like, the grand scheme of the season, but the Shy actually played really well in this game, so I'm going to give him a lot of credit for it. But this is a really good game from Weibo. We've seen a lot of dominating wins, and again, I don't mean to be that guy. Blue side's pretty freaking good right now, huh? Red side, like, mind controls you into picking Nico Nocturne into a better team and just kind of losing early and having no pressure the entire game, and that's pretty good. Like, I would say that that is a pretty positive interaction for Weibo to have. As much as I do like the Nico Nocturne combo, I do think that you really should not be playing it in this series, and it's clearly not working out for you, but credit to Weibo for being able to capitalize on some of the mistakes that Ninjas in Pyjamas is making, and honestly just, like, outplaying them at basically every opportunity. This was a stomp. Like, this was a destruction of NIP. This game 3 was not close at all. Player of the game for me is going to go to Crisp in the support position. In my opinion, he's the best player on Weibo. I think Xiaohu is very much in that conversation. Light, I think, is very much in that conversation. All three of them are really good, but Crisp honestly goes under the radar for just how amazing he has been for this team. He is a really good support, probably close to top 5 in the world. Like, I don't know if I'd put him in that category, but he's at the very least in the conversation, and I don't think he necessarily gets talked about like that by a lot of communities, but I definitely really like what Crisp has been able to do for this team. Him and Light actually have very good synergy together in the bot lane. I think Crisp's engages are really good for Light, somebody who's not necessarily the most aggressive AD carry in the entire world. He's really not passive. Like, he will go out there and win games if he has to, but he's going to be much more comfortable if you allow the support to be a little bit more aggro and set up plays for him, and that's what Crisp has been able to do for this team. So really like what he was able to do. Great rel game. This champion looks so brainless when it works, like when it's, you know, when you're playing from ahead and when you can get those flanks and those free engages onto squishy targets. It just looks incredibly difficult to stop. Photic certainly thought it was brain dead in this game, which we will get to in a bit. He did not have a very good one, but Light doing a good job following up on something like the Callista. We've seen it be pulled out significantly more frequently recently, mostly in the West. We saw Hans-sama do it. We saw Tactical do it a bit in the LCS as well. We've just been seeing a bigger rise and a bigger priority on Callista. I can can see the idea. A lot of, hyper scaling ADCs in the current meta that aren't as good and aren't as efficient in the early game get something that can punish that and, try and snowball the game out of control. Kalista's very good for that. And I think that Light played it well. Xiaohu had another good game on the Azir. Weiwei was awesome on the Vi again. This seems to be a champion that just really works for Weibo. It gives Weiwei everything that he wants. And then, like I said, the Shy was actually phenomenal in this game. He destroyed Invincible in that top lane matchup. I think he did most damage in the game. I'm not entirely sure about that, but still, I mean, this is the best performance the Shy has had in a very long time. I can't remember the last time I was like, oh my god, like I'm noticing him so much. This was just a really good game, no major mistakes, just a lot of damage, a lot of trading, a really good laning phase. This is the Shy that you want to see. He wasn't necessarily dominating like the map, but you don't need him to do that. He's the top laner. He can just kind of dominate his lane and then translate that into whether or not the rest of the team is winning. And so just good stuff from Weibo. Pretty dominant win. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas, pretty dominant loss. Like, you kind of got run over in this game. This is probably the least close game that we've talked about in the LPL playoffs up until this point, and this has got to be a confidence destroyer, right? Shadow and Angel pulling out that Nocturne Nico again and having it fall completely flat again. Invincible got run over in the top lane matchup. He got counterpick in the top lane, picked the Jax into the Cassante, which can be a relatively positive matchup for the Jax, but not if you're just getting outplayed, like Invincible did in game number 3. And speaking of getting outplayed, dud of the game is going to go to Photic in the bot lane. I don't know, man. I don't know. Like, every single time I say this, people get mad at me, but Photic's just good, right? He's not great. He's just good. And when you get a great support like Crisp on the other side of the map, that it's just going to punish him when you play Kalista and you put Photic on something that's not necessarily going to be as easy to pilot in the early game. Not that Jinx is, like, not easy to pilot, but it is susceptible to rel engages, and Kalista's going to have pressure in that matchup, and Photic's just not going to be able to survive that. He's had so many games that he's almost single-handedly lost for NIP. This split, not just this year, in summer, when this team actually has been good. He's one of the players with the most amount of dud of the series in this year so far, and, he has games like this, and it's frustrating. I know a lot of people really want to say that Photic is a top 580 carry in the LPL, right? But it's just not the case. It's just not true. I could, off the top of my head, name 680 carries that he just shouldn't be in the conversation with, and so I don't know, man. I don't know. I know I'm lower on Photic, but this is the kind of performance that I think comes up way more often than you would expect. Zhuo also wasn't very good on the Rakan. The bot lane in general just kind of got run over. It was a really big bot gap for Weibo in this game, most notably. Top gap as well. I think that was definitely the case. And Weiwei, I think, was really good. Xiaohu was really good in that same vein. Weibo just kind of gapped them everywhere. Definitely the better team. A 23-minute win, 18-2, 10 towers to 0. All of this tells the story of just how much Weibo won this game. But NIP's going to have to figure it out because their season is on the line. If they lose this game number 4, 2023 is over for them. And if Weibo wins it, they're going to be moving on to face LNG, a team that they absolutely can and have beaten this split already. So an interesting matchup here, but Game 4 is really going to determine a lot. Is Weibo going to be able to close it out, or is NIP going to take us to another game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Weibo Gaming. They are able to take game number 4. They're able to close out this series 3-1. And that's it for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Their 2023 season is going to come to an end here. Honestly, I don't think it was as bad or as good as I think some, people expected. I think it was probably right in the middle in terms of expectations. We'll get to them in a bit. But let's talk about Weibo because they are moving on. This is a playoff win for Weibo, something that is really not all that guaranteed for this organization. It certainly wasn't in spring, and it certainly wasn't in 2022. And so to see them be able to pick this up and do it with such confidence, I think is a really, really good sign. Now, there definitely still are concerns for this team, but the positives really are there. Some of these players played incredibly well over the course of this entire series. I'm looking at quite a few of them, and actually player of the series for this series in particular is probably the most difficult it's ever been. I don't think I could highlight one individual player for Weibo as a player of the series. I'm going to, because that's what I do, but it really is kind of difficult to find a player to say this was the most consistent player over the course of this series. But player of the game for me in game number 4 has to go to Xiaohu. He was phenomenal, and actually, he's also going to get my player of the series. I definitely considered Light, I definitely considered Crisp, but for me, I think Xiaohu was the most important player on Weibo Gaming across this entire series. We haven't necessarily been pointing him out as like the biggest superstar. Light was great, and Weiwei was great in game 1. Crisp and the Shy were great in game 2, but Xiaohu was the star in game 4, or I should say game 3 for Crisp and the Shy. Xiaohu was the star in game 4, and he was the player that was right there with all all of those players in the rest of them as well. And I really do think that he was the most consistent and most important player for Weibo in this series. This game 4 from him was absolutely disgusting. His scoreline definitely does not tell the story. He was consistently finding flank opportunities in every single fight to just completely destroy NIP. And they tried to protect against it. I saw a lot of comments that are like, why was NIP not trying to protect against it? They were warding. They were trying to figure out the avenues in which Xiaohu was going to get to their backline, but Xiaohu did a great job of knowing exactly where that vision was and capitalizing on that and going a different direction, being able to consistently get Shuriman shuffle flanks onto basically the entire backline of NIP. Fodik in particular was caught out with that over and over again, and without Xiaohu, this game is not nearly as easy as it was for Weibo. This is probably the most contentious game of the entire series, but Weibo, I think, still had pretty full control over the entire game, so good stuff from Xiaohu, and he's going to go underrated, as he always has for a great mid laner, but he's the type of player that can carry this team to Worlds. He really is good enough for that. One of the more interesting players in the entire world, in my opinion. But Light and Crisp were also fantastic. They were the other two players that I said I was considering for player of the series, and I think both of them could get it. Light, mostly because he dominated in this series, or at least was the better AD carry in this series, on non-meta picks, things like the Neela, things like the Ezreal, things like the Kalista, which is super cool to see. You're not really seeing a lot of players pick up those champions, especially in a, win or go home kind of playoff series, so this was really cool to see from Light. He just continues to be such a rock for every team that he's played for in the bot lane. Crisp has also been very good. I've talked about how I'm not a huge fan of Leona right now, but he was really good on Leona in this game, and I thought it definitely worked for them. The Shy was a little bit too much in this game. This was definitely more of, the negative version of the Shy. He was definitely dealing a lot of damage, and man, he was picking up some kills, but he just overextended way too much in this game, and I think if he had just played a little bit more safe, it would have been an even easier win for Weibo. A lot of the gold that did end up going in the pockets of NIP were it was just the Shy giving it to them basically for free in the form of shutdowns, and so not an ideal situation, but Weiwei was awesome on Ivern, a champion that's very strong right now. Weibo just looked very good in this series. They were definitely the better team, but they really should have been, and so to see them, kind of, I guess, live up to expectations in a series like this, it's a good sign, because this is not always the team that does that. We'll talk about them again in a second, but for NIP, that's going to be the end of their season, and honestly, it's hard to pinpoint whether or not this was a positive or negative split. I think this is the kind of result that, honestly, you would take, if you're an NIP fan. Finishing in 7th, 8th place in the summer split, I think is definitely better than what I expected them to do, even when I was higher, I guess you could say, on them in the preseason, and when everybody else was higher on them, I was lower on them in terms of public perception. A lot of people had this team as like a 7th or 8th place team. I didn't. I think I had them at number 9 in my preseason predictions. They were number 16 in my post-spring predictions, and they were just not a very good team. I don't think a lot of people expected them to be able to make the playoffs here in summer after how bad their spring split was, but they were able to rebound. They were able to bring in, Shadow and Angel, who really adapted and became the stars of this team, and things ended up working out for them in the end. I think we saw some good growth from Invincible as a player. Fodik and Juo were definitely a little bit of a weakness throughout this year, but I think for the most part, there are definitely things that you can use to grow on into next year. Fodik was just kind of bad in this series, and it's just kind of been a similar story for him throughout his entire, LPL history, or his playoff history in particular, is that, there are going to be games where he looked good. He really got finally a good playoff series against RNG, but it really was the first time in the playoffs that he ever had to go up against an AD carry that he wasn't just worse than. The first time he got to go up against an AD carry, he was just better than an LP, and in every other series, he's had to go up against an AD carry that he's not as good as, and Light definitely fits that bill, and Fodik was not able to keep up in this series. He was consistently out of position. The enemy team did a lot to try and shut him down, and they were super successful, and I think that's just kind of been a trend for him. I think Zhuo's just kind of whatever as a support, and I really don't know what I would do if I was NIP. I know Fodik has a really nice reputation in terms of the league, but I'm so much lower on him than I think any other analyst is that I think it certainly would be a conversation to move on from him if it were me, but Angel was okay in this game on the Jace, an incredibly OP pick. Shadow was alright on the Maokai, did more damage than Fodik did in this game, which is never a good sign. Invincible was fine on the Rumble, a bad performance, and that's another broken pick, and Invincible is always going to be a feast or famine player, but I just think his feast moments were significantly more common than what Fodik was offering. I think just in general, NIP should be happy with the result that they got in this split and in this season, just because, if you're looking at this talent, finishing top 7 or 8 in the league, like, that's still pretty freaking good considering the situation, and so I know it's not maybe the outcome that they wanted, but I think it's probably the outcome that they most expected, and I think they're going to be able to move in to next season and hopefully figure out a way to be a little bit more consistent. But for Weibo, they're now moving on. We're going to preview their series in just a second, but congratulations to this team for winning a playoff series. It's not always the easiest thing to do for a team as feast or famine as they are, but they're now in the conversation to be going to Worlds, and this is a team that basically everybody in the LPL actually has to watch out for. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Round 2 overview and analysis video. Do hope you guys enjoyed the analysis section. Up on the screen, the updated bracket here in the LPL. We can go ahead and preview our Round 3 matchups at this point. And, unlike Rounds 1 and 2, I think both of these series in Round 3 are really, really interesting. And I honestly could see any of these 4 teams moving on. I'm going to preview them here, but I really do mean it when I say that these are maybe going to be the 2 closest series of the playoffs. EDG OMG was certainly a toss-up for me, but both of these 2 series I could see absolutely going either way. Let's start with EDG versus Top Esports. EDG moving on here to face Top. I think if EDG plays up to their talent level, they actually probably should be the favorites in this series. I really do like Top, but players like Rookie and Mark, Rookie's certainly not been playing at that level in 2023. He's had a really rough year for his standards. He's still been fine, I think, generally overall, but he's really not been a great mid laner. He's just been a good mid laner for this team, and I think that's exploitable by EDG. Mark is somebody who has, maybe struggled against, really talented competition in the past, even if I really do like him, and I think he's way better than people give him credit for. Someone like Wayward, I think, could struggle into Ale. I can see the reasons why Top Esports might not necessarily do as well in a matchup like this, but all of this is contingent on the idea that EDG can generate consistent leads in this series, and that's kind of been a problem for this team, or let alone keep the leads, right? This is a team that has thrown a lot of gold advantages throughout this split as well, and at the end of the day, I really do believe the best players in the series are on the side of Top Esports. I think Jackie Love is the best player on the Rift. I think Tion has been really good this split. He's been better than Jejet, and so because of that, I'm going to take Top Esports, but man, even of these 2 series, I think this is the closest one. If EDG won and if EDG stopped them, I would not be surprised at all, even a little bit. I could absolutely see a world in which EDG is just the better team here, but I could also see a world in which EDG just doesn't have it, and they're not consistent enough to be able to overcome, the best players on Top Esports, and I really do think that this team has the potential to be one of the best in the entire world. It's going to be a really fun series to watch, and I'm really looking forward to it, but then we have LNG versus Weibo Gaming. This is another one that I think is really a toss-up, because if Weibo plays up to their potential, we've already seen them be able to beat LNG rather consistently in the regular season. They dominated them in the regular season. They were definitely the better team. Now, LNG has certainly gotten a lot better as a team since then, and that's why I'm going to be picking LNG in this series, because I do think that their weaknesses are just significantly less exploitable than what Weibo's are. I think you're really relying on the Shy and Weiwei in particular to, have good series, and that's not always going to be the case against LNG, and I really think when you look across the board, Xiaohu's a great player, but Scout might be one of the few mid laners in the LPL that I would take over him. I really like Light, but Gala might be one of the few AD carries that I would take over him, right? A lot of the positive carry threats from Weibo, I think, might just be a little bit outmatched. However, LNG can also be rather inconsistent. Tarzan in particular in the playoffs has not always been the best player in the entire world, and so I do think this could be a little bit of a toss-up, but I'm going to take LNG. I trust Scout and Gala in particular to really be able to carry this team over the top, but again, I think this series could be interesting. Maybe not quite as much of a back and forth as I think EDG Top Esports should be, but I still think that this should be a fun series between 2 good teams, but I want to know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Let me know who you think is going to be able to come out of both of these series and why. Like I said, I really do believe all 4 of these teams deserve to be in the top 4, so really going to be interesting to see how things end up working out. But if you enjoyed the video, not only let me know down in the comment section below, but hit a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering every single game in the LPL playoffs, and not only the LPL, we're going to be covering all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL on this channel. With playoff season basically rolling at this point in a lot of the different regions, it's the perfect time to hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.